Hi, it's Dwyer. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. Also, dwyercrime.blog, a free site. Today is August 30th, 2025. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Folks, let's revisit the Kennedy assassination. By chance, yesterday I was sitting down watching Amazon Prime Video, I believe, and they had a show on the Kennedy assassination, and they claimed it was updated with new information, right? I saw that it was copywritten this year, 2025. But the show itself was disappointing. Understand, the problem with the Kennedy assassination is that people start going down roads that the evidence simply doesn't support. We can speculate about what happened, we can come up with provocative theories, but we really need to discount theories for which there simply is no factual support. More importantly, if you take a step back, the actors themselves wouldn't be motivated to act in that manner. In fact, let me pivot here and say, I believe all of these murder mysteries will be solved with the help of AI, right? Because I believe AI is going to focus on what's relevant. Just understand, there's a theory out there, and it gets a lot of time, and it's a little bit surprising, that the mob, notably the Chicago outfit, killed John F. Kennedy, that they were betrayed by Kennedy. They helped Kennedy win the state of Illinois. In fact, if you follow this road a little bit further, the argument is that they helped Kennedy win a key primary when he was going for the party nomination. They may have helped Kennedy in the state of Texas, where that's another state where dead people voted in addition to in Illinois, right? And the argument was that Kennedy then in office hired his little brother as Attorney General, and Bobby Kennedy then went after the mob, right, to kind of show Big Brother as some kind of anti-crime politician. The mob supposedly was, outraged at this and decided to assassinate the President of the United States. Let me make a few points here. The Chicago outfit is still with us, folks. The Chicago outfit remains one of the most lucrative criminal organizations in the United States. More importantly, at the time of Kennedy's assassination, just understand, we have misidentified the players. The head of the mob, the head of the Chicago outfit at the time, is Tony Accardo, not Sam Giancana, right? It's Tony Accardo. He was the day-to-day mob boss in the 50s. Understand, he still wielded huge power over Sam Giancana in the 1960s. Now, anyone who has researched the mob understands that Tony Accardo was very different from Sam Giancana. Giancana was the guy who loved the public limelight. By contrast, Tony Accardo was someone who always wanted to be invisible. The fact that many people watching this video may never have heard of Tony Accardo shows you how brilliant he was at being invisible. Now, outside of the evidence, I believe we all understand that a decision by a criminal organization to kill a current president of the United States carried a high risk of being existential. In other words, if the mob decided to kill President Kennedy, they would have to realize that there was the distinct possibility that the outrage would have been so severe that there would have been a war on organized crime targeting the Chicago outfit, and that the mob may well have lost that war. Right, folks? You need to view the mafia as an entire economy. It's not a group of old men sitting around a table, talking about petty crimes or talking about controlling neighborhoods. No, you really do need to view it as an entire economy. Right now, we know the mob was working with parts of the Kennedy administration to try to assassinate Fidel Castro. We also understand, too, that the mob had an earlier relationship with our federal government. It just does not make any sense whatsoever that no matter how upset people were by a perceived betrayal by the President of the United States, it makes no sense that a highly lucrative organization would risk its existence to get vengeance on someone who they helped get elected president. It doesn't make sense. Understand, the narrative seems to involve Sam Giancana being a womanizer. Understand, Giancana and Kennedy both had a relationship with Judith Campbell. This was a coup for the mob, not a burden. Right? They had never been this embedded in an administration. The idea that because they were upset, they would then decide to kill the president, end that relationship, right? Just to kind of, express some anger, maybe prove a point to their competitors, is simply absurd. We'll get back to the mob. We'll mention Jack Ruby later in this video. But I need for folks to understand that a lot of the folklore about the JFK assassination has already been resolved. In other words, we don't have to fantasize about reporters such as Dorothy Kilgarden having inside information. Right? We already have enough information to know that the Warren Commission findings are fictitious. Right? Understand, Lyndon Baines Johnson actually had a friend on the Warren Commission, Richard Russell. And Russell himself flatly told LBJ that he didn't think Lee Harvey Oswald with a misaligned rifle could be as precise in hitting the president in a moving car as the Warren Commission thought he was. Right? In other words, not everyone on the Warren Commission understood it was a Mickey Mouse operation. And the story they gave, right, the story they concluded, the version they reached simply didn't make sense to some members of the commission itself. Well, I need for folks to understand that that story, that version of events, has been debunked because it's premised on the idea that one bullet could hit President Kennedy, the first shot that hits Kennedy, travel to the front seat, cause the wounds to Governor Connolly, shatter Governor Connolly's wrist, even as the video shows Governor Connolly holding his hat with the hand in which his wrist is shattered. Right, folks? Since the Warren Commission was released, a Secret Service agent who, by the way, had a ongoing dialogue with Clint Hill, his fellow Secret Service agent, over the years. Clint Hill, of course, is the secret agent who pushes Jackie back into the car, gets Jackie off the back of the limo back into the car. Right? Just understand that Paul Landis, that's his name, has now come forward, and people are at an age now where they're looking at their own mortality. So folks, before they leave us, are revealing their truths. Right? Paul Landis had an ongoing dialogue with Clint Hill, who told him, don't go public. Right? Clint Hill did not want Paul Landis going public. And Paul Landis has gone public with the fact that he is the person who took the so-called magic bullet out of the presidential limousine that Johnson had cleaned shortly after the assassination. Before it's cleaned, Paul Landis is the one who finds the magic bullet not in the front seat, but in the back seat, where Kennedy was sitting. Right, folks? The Warren Commission's work has been discredited by the fact that the bullet never travels to the front seat to hit Governor Connally. Right, folks? Paul Landis, Landis, has written a book on this. Right? This was kept from us because, of course, Landis was a Secret Service agent who was loyal to the United States. He did not want to give a version of events that contradicted the Warren Commission. Let me also say, too, that assassination buffs have long known that there are major chain of custody issues involving that so-called magic bullet. Right? Understand, Landis claims he goes to the hospital and leaves the bullet on the stretcher. We even know how the bullet gets to the hospital and is left on the stretcher. It's from Paul Landis. Right, so folks, you can view the Warren Commission however you wish. Right? You could, look at the commission as some well-intended people led by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who came to the wrong conclusion, or you could view the Warren Commission as something more nefarious. But the one thing you have to realize is that the historical record shows that the Warren Commission's findings are incorrect. We know that. Folks, there shouldn't even be a dispute about that. Right? Let me also point out, too, Clint Hill was a member of the United States Army from 1954 to 1957. Understand, the United States used to have a draft. Many of the people who played a role in the events surrounding the Kennedy assassination had military experience. Right, folks? You should know that as Clint Hill climbs into the presidential limo and looks at President Kennedy, you should know that according to Clint Hill himself, he knew Kennedy was dead at that moment. Kennedy's eyes are open. Kennedy has a glassy look on his face. Right? He understood that whether or not Kennedy had a beating heart at that moment, he knew that Kennedy would not recover. Right, folks? That's literally moments after Kennedy is shot. Kennedy's pronounced dead at 1 p.m. He's dead well before then. Right? At a minimum, Kennedy could no longer serve as president had he miraculously been saved. Just understand, Kennedy was mentally compromised. Right? Again, when Clint Hill looks at the president's eyes are open. But the president is not there. Now let's just focus on just some minor facts that should establish that reasonable doubt exists as to whether or not Kennedy was even killed by a shot from the back. In other words, Lee Harvey Oswald likely would not have been convicted of murder. At best, he may have been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. That's if you believe that the figure that multiple people saw from the street of the person on the 6th floor who was firing a rifle, and someone is on the 6th floor holding a rifle. We know that at a minimum. If you believe that that person was Lee Harvey Oswald, and understand, Oswald is seen by Officer Marion Baker and Oswald's own boss on the 2nd floor in the soda room no more than 90 seconds after the assassination. Right? If you believe that Oswald was able to hit the staircase immediately after the assassination, right, wiping down the gun on which none of his fingerprints are found, right, then hiding the gun, then going on the stairs where other employees were unnoticed to be found on the 2nd floor by Baker, who runs into the building after he sees pigeons fly off of it immediately after the shots. Right? If you believe that Oswald is the guy on the 6th floor, I need for folks to just ask the question on whether any bullets from Oswald played a role in the assassination of President Kennedy. Because understand, you have a doctor, and I believe this guy, understand, the major players in the assassination are the people on the periphery. Dr. Robert McClellan, who drew what he saw, who gave interviews in the years after the assassination, he's in the room with Kennedy's body at Parkland Hospital. Right? Now, this is a medical doctor, right, who, had privileges at Parkland Hospital. In other words, he's, independently in Dallas. Right? Has nothing to do with the assassination. The assassination happens. They bring Kennedy's body to Parkland Hospital. He looks at the back of Kennedy's head, and he sees a hole the size of a baseball in the back of Kennedy's head. Right? Now, I'll give Prime Video credit. They have an interview of him. He points to the part of Kennedy's head where he sees the hole. Right, folks? The hole is clearly an exit wound for a bullet that hits Kennedy from the front. Right? Because Robert McClellan is a medical provider. That's the reason why he's there. He's not a member of the mob or, someone with any other agenda. And because our criminal burden of proof is so high, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If any juror, it wouldn't have to be the full jury. If any individual juror believes or believed what McClellan would say at trial, Oswald would not be convicted of murder, because the prosecution's version of events would have Oswald behind the president, up at the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Oswald couldn't have caused the hole in the back of the president's head. Somebody else would have to have caused that hole. And the government's version of events excludes the idea of conspirators. Let's go further. Right, folks? Just Robert McClellan alone discredits the Warren Commission. He discredits something much more profound than the Warren Commission. Understand, the autopsy is inconsistent with what Robert McClellan saw. Kennedy's corpse, the photos in the autopsy, are either a later fabrication, an alteration of Kennedy's body, or McClellan is incorrect. They're mutually exclusive. It's one or the other. Right? If McClellan is correct, then the photos from the autopsy are altered. They're unreliable. They're part of a cover-up. My point to you is simply, as powerful as the Chicago outfit is, as powerful as the mafia is, they don't have the power to fake a presidential autopsy. The only group that could fake the autopsy is the United States government. So if you're watching a Kennedy show and they're, telling you about people in the mob who had an incentive to kill Kennedy, just ask yourself, would they have the power to fake the autopsy? And understand, as I've mentioned in other videos, there are other witnesses who saw things inconsistent with the autopsy photos. Let's go one step further. Again, the Kennedy assassination is very simple to understand. Right? Dr. Malcolm Perry was a captain in the United States Air Force Medical Corps. A captain. Right? Believe it or not, 3 times. 3 times. Perry, who performed the tracheotomy on John F. Kennedy, right, when his body arrives at Parkland, a tracheotomy is done on the throat wound And 3 times that day, early on, 3 times, Dr. Perry said that the wound on Kennedy's throat, in his opinion, was an entry wound. Right, folks? What are the odds? Right? You have not just Robert McClellan, you have a second healthcare provider who's telling you that Kennedy was shot from the front. Right? The first shot that hits him in the throat came from the front. In other words, the 2 shots that hit Kennedy, the shot that splits apart his head and the shot in the throat, you have healthcare providers saying that both of those shots came from the front. Now, this is the evidence that matters. This is the forensic evidence. Right? This is what matters. Now, in the car, at the time the shooting takes place, Governor Connolly's recollection, he's in the front seat, is that his wife says to Kennedy, "You can't say Dallas doesn't love you," something like that. Then the shots ring out, and Kennedy says, "I've been hit." Words to that effect. Words to that effect. Connolly, who's seen turning around a bit in the car, is supposed to have said, "My God, they're going to kill us all." Words to that effect. Right? So it's interesting that after being hit, Kennedy is actually able to say something. Right? Hit in the throat. Right? But more importantly, just understand, how is Connolly able to turn around, if you believe the Warren Commission, and actually talk and say, "My God, they're going to kill us all," if he's hit with the same bullet that hits Kennedy in the throat? And how's he able to do so while holding his hand if that same bullet shattered his wrist? Right, folks? The evidence doesn't line up. So understand, we can fantasize about Dorothy Kilgallen. Right? We can say, "Oh, she may have had evidence." Right? "Oh, they killed her because she had evidence." Folks, she couldn't have had evidence better than this. Right? A doctor who was in the room at Parkland Hospital, who had an opportunity to have an extended look at the hole in the back of Kennedy's head. Folks, that's better than any piece of evidence the Warren Commission has. Don't be distracted by boxes behind the president on the 6th floor of a building that might not have had any role in the bullets that hit the president and that hit Governor Connolly. Right? Connolly himself, of course, believed that there was a second shooter, that he was hit with a different bullet than the president was hit with. Right? He's always maintained that. Just understand, the Warren Commission gives you a narrative. You have to ask yourself whether it's a deliberate distraction. Right? Now, Malcolm Perry, of course, the tracheotomy doctor, is later pressured to change his statement. He later said that he was so concerned with trying to save the life of the president that, he may have been mistaken in, any thoughts he had. He didn't do a thorough investigation into whether it was an entry wound or an exit wound. Right? You need to realize his initial statements. This is a military veteran. His initial statements, which he says not once, not twice, 3 times, is that it was an entrance wound. Well, let's go one step further. Right? Again, Kennedy assassination, very simple. They find a bone fragment that's consistent with coming off the back of someone's head in Dealey Plaza. When I say they, no, someone named Harper. Not our government. Some third party is in Dealey Plaza and finds a bone fragment. It's been called the Harper fragment. It's one of the most important pieces of evidence in the Kennedy assassination. Understand what Harper did. He turned it over to the government. Understand why we can't match the Harper fragment with Kennedy's skull. That's because our government lost the Harper fragment. In other words, in investigating one of the biggest assassinations in American history, our government lost a bone fragment that may have matched the hole in the back of the president's head. It's worse than that, folks. You see the Zapruder film. Right now, understand, in the 1960s, apart from some photos in Life magazine, they kept the Zapruder film from the American public. Right? Believe it or not, it's in the 70s when Geraldo Rivera was a young man and he was with Dick Gregory and somebody else that they showed the Zapruder film late at night on TV. Until then, the American public had never seen the Zapruder film. Now, on the Zapruder film, you see Kennedy's brain coming out the side of his head. It's on a film. The film's very bloody. Right? Clint Hill has talked about how parts of the president's brain were all around. But yet, the brain they had for the autopsy is regular size. It hasn't lost major parts. This is at odds with Clint Hill, the secret agent who's on the back of the vehicle. Right? He recalls seeing parts of the brain all over the place. This is at odds with the Zapruder film, where you see the brain coming out of the president's head. Right? Now, just understand, we can't do a DNA analysis of the brain that is part of our autopsy. We can't even weigh the brain that was part of the presidential autopsy. Because, believe it or not, like the Harper fragment, our government has lost the president's brain. Right, folks? This is a cover-up, and it's a bad cover-up. Right? The real question we should be asking isn't who killed the president, because understand, our government would have no incentive to lose the Harper fragment, the president's brain. They'd have no incentive to pressure Malcolm Perry to say that it was a shot from the back. Right? They would have no incentive to come up with a magic bullet theory if they weren't involved in the actual assassination. right? They wouldn't do this to cover up the fact that President Kennedy had Addison's disease. That's minor compared to the bigger picture of maintaining credibility. Right? So understand, the real question in history is not whether Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president. We know he didn't. Right, folks? We know that because the shots hit the president from the front. Even if Oswald was trying to kill the president. Let's say Oswald, the curtain rods that he has, supposedly, could have been a sandwich, that he has the day of the murders. Let's say he's the one firing outside the window, right? And of course, Howard Brennan couldn't confirm that he was the one. Right? Let's say he's the person on the 6th floor with a rifle who has something pointed out the window at the president that people see. Let's say he showed up and he thought, I'm going to kill the president of the United States. Right? And let's just say by chance, his landlord, Michael Payne, his mother, just happens to be close friends with Allen Dulles' mistress. Let's just say that that's all by chance. Right? That Lee Harvey Oswald just happens to be a tenant of the son of Allen Dulles' mistress's close friend. Right? Let's just say that we'll agree with that for purposes of this argument. Right, folks? There simply isn't enough evidence to link the hole in the back of the president's head, the shots that hit Governor Connally, with Oswald's rifle. Let's go one step further. The link we've been given is the magic bullet. Right? That's the link. Well, we now know that the magic bullet didn't hit Connally. We now know that the chain of custody on the magic bullet would likely lead to its exclusion as evidence at any criminal trial. Right, folks? Let me say this too, diplomatically. Could you imagine being a juror member and have a Secret Service agent who was protecting the president that day tell you that he's the one who put the bullet on the stretcher? Right, folks? I mean, just understand, whatever ballistic tests were done on that bullet have to be viewed with suspicion, because we don't know if that bullet was actually that bullet. Not only that, you have to put the gun that doesn't have Oswald's fingerprints on it in Oswald's hands. How do you do that when he's seen on the 2nd floor, less than 2 minutes after the assassination? Is that sufficient time to wipe the gun, to dump the gun, to go down a staircase that has other floors with employees on them at a time when there are at least 2 employees who claim that the minute they heard a gunshot, they ran to that same staircase? Also, understand, Baker and Roy Truly, I believe his name is, Oswald's boss. So the ID on Oswald is a clear one. Oswald's boss sees him on the 2nd floor. Neither of them see Oswald breathing heavily. Right? Let's talk Jack Ruby. Now, Ruby clearly has mob ties. Right? Here's a shock. At a time when the idea of having a strip club for a group that may need to launder money, may need to have a cash business in which people are, giving them money, and they can then attribute the money they've gotten, ill-gotten gains that they've gotten from criminal activity, to revenue from a strip club that deals in cash. Right? Here's a shocker. A guy running a strip club called the Carousel in Dallas might have had mob ties. Right, folks? Understand Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby had deep mob ties. Right? He came to Dallas with a mob-related past. Right? The Warren Commission, the fact that the Warren Commission found that Jack Ruby had no meaningful mob ties should discredit anything else the Warren Commission had to report. Right? Well, I'm not here disputing that Jack Ruby had mob ties. But what I am disputing is the role of the mob. Let's say Jack Ruby's authorized by the mob to kill Lee Harvey Oswald. Right, folks? I believe at best, that's the mob's role in all of this. It's not the assassination of the president. Because again, that would be existential. Right? If, any criminal enterprise killed the president of the United States without the complicity of the deep state, they would be risking annihilation. Right? Trump right now has the National Guard in D.C. Right? And that's without any, presidential assassination on his watch. Could you imagine what would be roaming through Chicago if the Chicago mob killed the president without authorization from members of the government? Right? Tony Accardo, folks, that would be completely off character for him. Right? Accardo, by the way, was upset with Giancana for being too high profile. Right? Accardo's vision of the mob is that they're invisible. They're making profits. They're a business. Again, you have to look at the mob as a full-fledged economy. Right? Accardo doesn't want you to be able to recognize him or anybody else in his organization. Now, we know the mob couldn't have killed the president because the cover-up is too thorough and involves fake photos from the alleged presidential autopsy as well as a fake brain. Right, folks? It's an inside job. But let's say they have a loose thread. They're trying to frame a former Marine, Lee Harvey Oswald. Right? Understand, it's an open question on whether Oswald's even a Marxist. Right? Do you believe a Marxist would be the tenant of some guy whose family invented Bell helicopter? Right? Because, of course, that's who Michael Payne's family is. Right? His mother's good friends with the CIA director's mistress, for crying out loud. Do you really believe that Guy Bannister would vouch for a Marxist in New Orleans in the early 1960s? Right? Let me say this too. Oswald's in touch with James Hosty, right? FBI agent. Do you really believe that Oswald would write a note to Hosty and Hosty after the assassination would flush the note down the toilet if Oswald is just a run-of-the-mill Marxist? Wouldn't that note be strong evidence against Oswald if Oswald made a threat on the president or something like that? Right? Why don't we have a copy of that note? Why were no copies made, even for the intelligence community? Right? So understand, they have a guy who might actually be an asset. Right? They have a guy who might actually have worked for intelligence at some time. There's a loose thread. If someone from the government kills Lee Harvey Oswald, it's too much of an inside job, isn't it? Right? They're faking the autopsy. The president, if you believe some people, is in a different coffin than the one he was placed in. They're doing a lot of things, right? They're making sure that the autopsy, and this is a key moment. This is a key moment in all of this. They're making sure that the autopsy is not done by the state of Texas. Right? It's an inside job. They want their people to do the autopsy. And it's not like they picked Cyril Wecht. Understand, they didn't have some superstar do the autopsy. Right? So this is an inside job. If they want to kill Lee Harvey Oswald because they themselves know at least some of the shots that hit Kennedy hit him from the front, a trial might damage the cover-up. Right? Oswald's attorneys might go public with the chain of custody for the magic bullet. Right? Oswald's attorneys might, just as a matter of course, this is what attorneys do, take the depositions of the Secret Service agents who were by the presidential limousine. They may have taken the deposition of Paul Landis. Could you imagine in the 1960s hearing that the Warren Commission's magic bullet theory was a bunch of BS? Hearing a Secret Service agent say, no, this didn't fall out of the president's body. No, I placed it on the stretcher. I got it out of the car that was then cleaned by Lyndon Johnson. Right? One would have assumed the president's been assassinated, the limousine's a crime scene. One would have assumed that if Johnson's serious about finding out who killed the president, they would preserve the limousine. All of us Americans would understand the public can't view the limousine right now because the police are viewing it. Right? We would have all understood the limousine, is, out of respect for Kennedy. The limousine is being preserved for evidence taking by law enforcement. Instead, the line we were given is the opposite. Out of respect for Kennedy, we destroyed all the evidence in the limousine. Right? Even as the governor sitting in the front seat is firm in saying he believes he was hit by bullets different than the bullets that hit the president. Right? So, I believe what happened is the president's assassinated, then perhaps the mob was contacted. Right? Their involvement, to me, would be limited to killing Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't think the government would tell the mob how the president got killed, who killed the president. The mob doesn't know that. That information would be on a need-to-know basis, wouldn't it? Right? You only hire Jack Ruby, a guy who, by the way, is discovered in 1966 to have had cancer that spread throughout his body. Why might Ruby have taken this job? Maybe he owed someone a debt. Maybe it's 63, late 63, it's November of 63. Maybe he already knew that he had cancer. Right? We don't know. What we do know is in 66 he's diagnosed. The official story is that they thought he just had pneumonia. In other words, he had major cancer at that point. He had cancer that had spread throughout his body at that point. Maybe this is a guy who was dying and the mob came to him. Somebody said, hey man, look, we need for you to do something. Maybe he foolishly thought killing Lee Harvey Oswald was killing the assassin and that he would be a hero. That's a possibility, right? Because he probably did not know that the government offed John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was hit from the front. Parkland medical personnel saw a hole in the back of the president's head. Right? He might not have known all of that. Right? The conversations he had with Dorothy Kilgallen may have been more fantasy than anything else, part of the distraction from a guy who knew he had cancer, who may have just gotten a call and said, hey man, look, don't ask questions, take care of Oswald. Right? Haven't you been amazed that the prisoner who is the most notorious prisoner in government custody, who's being transferred on live TV, being watched by millions of people, somehow isn't safe from an assassin who is able to get just a few feet from Oswald and to fire and hit him in the body? Aren't you amazed by that? We still don't know how Ruby gets in the room. Folks, it's a crowded room. It's a televised room. Right? So, folks, believe it or not, there's less to the president's assassination than meets the eye. The big question is, why did they want to assassinate him? Right? I believe that's the truth that has, or perhaps it's speculation, that has the government lying to us for all these years, not releasing the documents to us. Right? What's the big secret? It's not just that the government killed Kennedy. I believe the big secret is why the government killed Kennedy. Now, we know he's a philanderer. Right? It seems to me that since he was that much of a philanderer, and since many of the women he was involved with were in their early 20s, and since he's not yet reelected, and he has formidable opposition, right? Everyone understood Barry Goldwater was going to run. Everyone understood that. Goldwater and Jack Kennedy talked about having a bunch of debates all over the country, right? Goldwater, and understand who Goldwater was. Goldwater was so respected that a decade later, when the Republican Party turned on Richard Nixon, it was Goldwater who they sent to tell the President of the United States that he could not rely on them to stop him from being removed from office. Right? That's how big Goldwater was. Formidable opposition for John F. Kennedy, who squeaks by Nixon, if you believe he did, legitimately, in the 60 election. Right? Well, one would have imagined if they wanted to get rid of the president, you would have imagined that they would have simply had someone who was fooling around with the president, who had a glass house around him, right? Who people like Sam Ervin, Lyndon Baines Johnson knew had Addison's disease, right? You would have thought that they would have leaked the fact that the president had Addison's disease and that the president was a philanderer. right? That would have killed Kennedy in the 64 election. If you want to get Kennedy removed from office, why not just leak some information, have the president have to explain himself? Understand, the president had bigger skeletons in the closet, right? He was taking B12 shots, if you believe that, from Dr. Feelgood. I'm not making this up, right? A guy nicknamed Dr. Feelgood. And the president was rumored to have mental health problems. Just food for thought. So, I think Kennedy was a great president, but Kennedy had his challenges, right? Extremely bad back that required shots. One would have thought that his enemies in the deep state or what have you would simply have made it impossible for him to win the 64 election. No, folks. The real secret here is why the deep state thought Kennedy had to be removed. Right? We know Kennedy had a fling with an East German spy. But I believe the deeper secret's even deeper than that. Right? I believe there must have been members of the deep state who thought that John F. Kennedy was an imminent threat to the United States, which is a little bit shocking because from what I've read, it's Kennedy who saves the country during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? You had people around him who wanted nuclear attacks and things like that, right? There's some part of Kennedy that deeply terrified the deep state, which thought that they needed to take immediate action, not finish him, right? Not finish him November 22nd. Put it this way, not finish him through the election process, but end his presidency on November 22nd, knowing that his VP, Lyndon Baines Johnson, former Senate Majority Leader, would become the President of the United States. Right? Why wouldn't they just subvert him in the 64 election and then have LBJ as Vice President win the Democratic nomination, and then, win the presidency through the electoral process? In other words, folks, the big secret with the Kennedy assassination isn't who killed Kennedy. The government already knows that. Right? Understand, in time, they realize you'll know that. Right? The secret's too big. The cover-up is messy to the point where, oh, they lost the Harper fragment. Oh, they lost the president's brain. Right? I mean, come on. The note that Oswald gave Hosty, that was flushed down the toilet and was never copied. Right? In other words, they've been busily trying to destroy evidence and stuff like that. Understand, the hole on the president's shirt, it's Gerald Ford, and you need to look at Ford carefully. It's Gerald Ford who summarily changes the hole on the president's shirt. They come up with some theory that the president's shirt was bunched up and other nonsense that's not supported by any photo. Right? So, the real secret, the real cover-up is why the deep state wanted Kennedy immediately removed. Apparently that news is still too shocking to be released. Donald Trump's a disappointment in terms of his release. They said, oh, we're releasing all of the documents. Right, folks? The release recently done was tepid. More importantly, it's not all of the documents. Right? They've thrown a lot of information at you so you don't know about Dr. Robert McClellan having an extended look at the baseball-sized hole in the back of the president's head. Right? They've thrown a lot of stuff at you so you don't know about Malcolm Perry 3 times saying the wound on the president's throat looked like an entry wound. right? We're still clinging to a Warren Commission based on a magic bullet that the Secret Service itself, Secret Service agent Paul Landis, has told you was never in the front seat of the presidential limo. Right? This bullet didn't have enough power to hit Connally. In fact, it didn't have enough power to get past where the president was sitting. Right? So let's just say I started watching this Prime Video show. When they got to the mob, I realized, wow, the makers of this show don't fully appreciate that the mob here is just a distraction or a group contacted after the fact to take care of Lee Harvey Oswald, probably on a need-to-know basis. Right? The conversation is likely, Jack, we heard you have cancer. We have a big ask. You owe us. We need for you to take care of the guy who shot the president. Right? I don't think Jack Ruby knows who shot the president. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. By the way, nor do we. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.